I was home alone one night, though I can't remember exactly why. All I know is that my family was out, and I was 15 or 16 at the time. I was a huge gamer, obsessed with StarCraft, and spent many nights gaming, often skipping out on social events. This was just before the COVID lockdown started, so it was just me and my computer on the first floor of the house. That night, as I was playing, the doorbell rang twice. I rushed to the door, not wanting to leave my game for too long, as I didn't want to lose my progress. I opened the door, asking, "Who is it?" A weak, soft voice on the other side mumbled something I couldn't quite hear. It sounded like a woman. I opened the door slightly, keeping the storm door between us. There stood an older woman, smiling at me, with her hands hidden behind her back. "Can I help you?" I asked. She told me she needed to use the phone and asked if she could come inside. Growing up, I was taught never to let strangers into the house, no matter who they were. But I wasn't sure how to send her away. I awkwardly directed her to the library down the street, figuring she could ask to use their phone. Of course, I knew the library was closed, but it was the first thing I could think of. Still smiling, she said, "That's very rude to turn away an old lady asking for help." I wasn't sure what else to say, so I explained that my parents don't allow strangers in the house. It was a house rule. As I slowly started to close the door, she didn't move. Her smile suddenly felt menacing. I went back to my room, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling, but the doorbell rang again. There was no way I would open the door this time. She had already made me uncomfortable, and now I was sure something wasn't right. I returned to my game, trying to distract myself, but soon I heard a tapping sound on the window, something metal, like a clink, right in front of my desk. The blinds were pulled down, but I had an awful suspicion. I turned off the sound on my computer. I didn't care about the game anymore. The tapping continued. Terrified, I left the room and sat in the dark living room. The doorbell rang again. She was still there, harassing me. I tried to convince myself that maybe she wasn't a threat, just a confused old woman. When she rang the doorbell a third and fourth time, I decided to open the door and ask if I could help her find someone to call. But when I opened the door, there was now a man standing there. "Have you seen my mother?" he asked. I said yes. She had just been there. He apologized, explaining that she had dementia, and then he asked if he could come in for just a minute. I felt awkward and wasn't sure why he needed to come inside. I said the same thing I'd said to her, that we could just talk through the door. I said I thought she had gone to the backyard. He thanked me and walked down the path. I watched for a bit, thinking he would go to the yard, but when I looked out the back window, there was no sign of him or his mother. They were both gone. At this point, my nerves were shot. The whole situation felt wrong. I decided to go to bed early that night, leaving the TV on in the background for comfort. But just as I was about to drift off, I heard that clinking sound again, tapping on the window. I went to the window, lifted the blind, and there she was, the same woman, smiling again, and tapping the glass with a kitchen knife. I closed the blind and crawled back into bed. The doorbell rang multiple times, but I ignored it. I didn't want to call the police, so I just stayed in bed, hoping it would end. Eventually, everything went quiet. The next morning, I told my dad what had happened. He agreed that I'd been smart not to open the door. Everyone thought it was an attempted robbery, but maybe there was a possibility that the woman really did have dementia and that man was her son. But it all seemed so coordinated. How did he know she had been at my house? Why didn't he check the backyard when I offered? There were too many questions that didn't add up. After my divorce 2 years ago, I was left spending my days in a house that was way too big for me. Living in that sparsely populated, extremely quiet, woodsy neighborhood while I was trying to sell it made for a pretty bleak existence. Then there came a Sunday night in July. Around 11 o'clock, I made the usual trek around each floor, shutting off the lights, then trudged up the stairs to go to sleep. In my bedroom, I checked my work email one last time, then closed my laptop and got into bed. I had never had much trouble sleeping until Kristen left. Now it sometimes took me an hour or so to drift off. I think it was about 11:45 when I heard, pretty clearly, a creaking sound on the stairs in the hallway. My bedroom door was closed, but the sound carried. I tensed up and laid perfectly still. A few seconds later, there was an identical sound, like a foot stepping up the staircase. It felt like my body temperature rose 10 degrees. I waited about 10 seconds more and heard nothing. It was a tremendous effort to get out of bed. I tried to do it without making a sound. I took 3 quick steps toward the bedroom door and slowly depressed the lock, hoping it wouldn't click too loudly. Only then did I really exhale. I pressed my ear to the door. 30 seconds, a minute, then 5. The difference between movies and real life is that in real life, I couldn't leave. I had to wait it out. There was no line or moment beyond which I felt safe, not after what I heard, and I didn't dare open the door. It was almost 20 minutes before I moved back to my bed and sat on the edge of it. My phone was on the nightstand charging. If I heard one more sound, I would call the police. There were 2 possibilities that I could accept. One, that the house was settling somehow due to recent weather. And 2, that Kristen had somehow come back into the house. But why? I crossed the room and looked out the window. Only my car was in the driveway. The end was anticlimactic. Just me sitting on the edge of my bed for so long that my eyes began to close and I was drawn into sleep. I laid down on top of my blankets, clutching my phone, and I awoke to sunlight pouring in through the window. Even then, it took some time to work up the nerve to open the bedroom door. I made 2 calls to coworkers before I did, and 1 to Kristen. I worked it into the conversation what had happened the night before. As I was getting ready to leave for work, I turned the TV on loud, intending to keep it running all day. Then I very reluctantly went down to check the finished basement. When I walked out the front door, I couldn't believe it. It was unlocked. I must have left it that way, maybe when I brought the groceries in. When I got home from work just before dark, my mood soured completely. I worked at the dining room table until about 9, then tried to watch the end of a movie. Outside, there were occasional silent flashes of lightning. It was oppressively hot, and we were expecting storms, but nothing had developed yet. Suddenly, there was a knock on the front door. I nearly dropped my scotch. I went and looked through the peephole. There was a woman standing outside, probably in her mid-30s, pale in the porch light. I'd never seen her before. I opened the door, but not all the way. She introduced herself as Karen, said she lived over on Grail Street, apologized for the late visit, and said that someone in her neighborhood was trying to organize a watch committee because of recent incidents. What kind of incidents? I asked. Prowlers, she said. I invited her into the foyer, thinking this was probably something I had some knowledge about. She thanked me for letting her in. She was on foot tonight and hadn't expected the storms. She told me there had been 2 break-ins that she knew of, both occurring when people were away. In one case, things were stolen. She was fuzzy about the details, but it didn't really matter since I don't know any of my neighbors myself. She said organizing the committee was really just an excuse to meet people nearby. I invited her into the living room so I could tell her about the night before. She took off her windbreaker and settled in. She reminded me of what people imagine when they think of a cat lady. Frumpy and awkward, swimming in oversized clothes. Very thin, very pale. We sat on opposite sofas, and I told her everything. From the beginning, to the sound, to realizing I had left my door unlocked overnight. As I spoke, she leaned forward, completely absorbed. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she asked where my wife had been. I explained the divorce, and then she asked something strange. She wanted to know if at some point while I had been sitting on the edge of my bed, if I had sensed something outside my bedroom door. I hesitated, because the truth was, yes. Almost as if I had been detecting someone in the hallway, like our presences were somehow connecting in the dark. Karen said she'd had a similar experience once, but she'd never told anyone. She asked a few more questions about Kristen and my job, how long we'd lived in the area. We talked about the neighborhood, and she mentioned renting a room nearby for the last several months. After about a half hour, I offered her something to drink. She accepted. I went into the kitchen and called out to her while I poured a soda over ice. We kept talking from the separate rooms for a minute or 2. Then I asked what she did for a living. No response. I assumed she hadn't heard me. I put the soda back in the fridge and turned, and there she was, standing in the kitchen entryway, smiling strangely. Her hands were raised beside her head, fingers curled into crude claws, like a child pretending to be a monster. "I'm the thing from your hallway," she said. For a second, I didn't know how to react. Then I laughed, made some comment about wishing it had felt that harmless. But she didn't laugh. She held the pose, still grinning, like she was waiting for something. I stepped forward and handed her the glass. She took it without a word and walked back into the living room. I followed. She went to the window overlooking the woods and stood there, staring out into the darkness. Then she started talking again, but not about anything we'd been discussing. She began listing the names of pets she'd had as a child, one by one, without turning around. Eventually, she shifted into a question about whether I had animals in my yard at night. She said she often mistaked raccoons or even deer for intruders. That made sense. This neighborhood was surrounded by woods. An idea hit me then. I told her I could give her a ride home, but first, I wanted to try something. I don't think I would have suggested it if I hadn't been just a little tipsy. I explained, if I went into my bedroom and she walked up the stairs the way someone naturally would, maybe I could compare the sound to what I heard the other night. Maybe I would find it reassuring. But even as I said it, I realized that I didn't really want to know. She agreed, a little too eagerly. I set my drink down and pointed toward the staircase. As I passed her heading upstairs, I noticed something about her hair. I could see a line where it didn't quite match. Her natural hair was tucked beneath a wig, which was darker than her light brown hair. Upstairs, I told her to stop about halfway. I went into my bedroom, closed the door, and lay down on the bed, trying to recreate the exact position I'd been in the night before. "Ready," I called out. Nothing. I was about to say it again when I heard that soft creaking sound. And then another, a louder creak. A chill ran through me. Fourth, fifth. It was unmistakably the same sound. I got up and opened the bedroom door, and for a second, I was confused. The hallway was dark. Karen had turned off the light and stood at the top of the stairs in shadow, grinning. Her hands were raised again as claws. But she wasn't standing in the middle of the step. She was pressed to the far edge, right against the wall on the bare wood, avoiding the carpet. But there's no way she should have known to do that. I waited for her to say something. She just kept smiling. I muttered a thank you. She giggled softly, but didn't lower her hands. I told her I needed to make a call, but she could make herself comfortable downstairs and I'd meet her in a few minutes. I stepped back into the bedroom, shut the door, and locked it. Just like the night before, I sat on the edge of the bed and realized my phone was downstairs. I was completely cut off. I just sat there, listening. She'd probably gone down the stairs at the same time I went into the room. But I couldn't recall hearing any sounds at all from the hallway. Something shifted. Something in the air felt heavier. And I suddenly understood exactly what the woman meant earlier when she described the feeling of someone waiting just beyond the door. Holding my breath, I leaned forward, staring at the gap beneath the door, squinting my eyes, trying to make out the shapes of her feet in the crack below the wood. Then, the doorknob rattled, stopped for a second, then shook again violently. I could hear her laughing to herself. And then she said,
"I'm the thing from the hallway, and I've come to get you."
She tried the knob a few more times before giving up. Then she said something else. I think it was a name, but I couldn't really tell, and it certainly wasn't mine.
"I'll come back when you're less bloody. I'll come back."
I heard her move away from the door. There was a faint shift in the floorboards, then the soft sound of her steps as she moved down the hallway and down the stairs. Then I heard nothing, and that was the worst part of all, because I had no idea if she'd actually left, or if she was still somewhere in the house. Then at once, I heard the front door open and slam again quickly. The entire house shook. I forced myself to wait at least a minute before I stood and crossed to the bedroom door. I opened it slowly. The hallway was empty, dark, still. I stepped out and went to the railing, looking down into the foyer. Nothing. No movement. No sounds. But I didn't trust it. Not yet. I moved quickly down the hall, around the corner, into the guest bedroom at the front of the house. I kept the light off, went straight to the window and looked out. There she was, walking down the driveway straight out onto the road. I lived at the end of a cul-de-sac. The only road out was a long, gradual incline, nearly half a mile to the main intersection. There were only a handful of houses out there, and beyond that, nothing but thick, dense forest. I went downstairs, picked up my phone, and opened the front door. Her shape was almost out of sight. I stepped outside and started following her. I don't know exactly why. I told myself that I had to make sure that she really left. She walked straight down the center of the road. I never saw her look back towards me or look around at anything at all. She just kept her pace, moving forward. She walked straight down the center of the road. I never saw her look back towards me or look around at anything at all. She just kept her pace, moving forward. She passed a large house and paid it no attention. Then another on her other side, and didn't look at that one either. Soon there was only one house left, at the far end. At the top of the slope, the house came into view. There was only one light on upstairs. Karen reached the driveway and walked past the parked minivan to the front door and knocked. After a few seconds, the door opened. I couldn't see clearly from where I was, just shapes. But it was obvious that there was a conversation, and it seemed like they didn't know her. Then they let her in, and the door closed. I stood there in the road and decided to call the police. I told the dispatcher there was a woman, possibly unstable, walking through the neighborhood. that she had just been in my house and I thought she had broken in the night before too. And now I had just seen her go into one of my neighbors' places. They said a car was nearby and would check it out, so I decided to wait. I approached the house. No other lights had turned on inside. I reached the curb when it started to rain a bit. Shortly after, the glow of headlights crested the hill behind me. The police had made it already. I turned and waved. The officer pulled up, stepped out, and I gave him the short version. Told him I might be overreacting, but wanted to be safe. He nodded and said he would check things out, told me to wait by the curb. He walked up to the front door, said something into his shoulder mic, then knocked. He waited a bit, then tried the handle. The door opened. He pushed it in just enough and stepped inside, leaving the door partially open behind him. I waited. 1 minute, 2, 5. Too long. Something was wrong. After 10 minutes, I couldn't stay put anymore. I walked to the front door and called out, "Hello?" No answer. I stepped inside. The foyer was dark, with a layout almost identical to mine. There was a sunken living room on the right, and the staircase was on the left. A burst of static made me jump from my skin. It came from the officer's radio. I heard a voice, but it was unclear, and then heavy footsteps, moving fast. The officer appeared at the bottom of the stairs with his gun drawn. He saw me and lowered it slightly, but his expression didn't change. He pulled me outside, where more units were starting to arrive. There was a cacophony of squealing tires and slammed doors, followed by boots on gravel and shouting voices. And then, once again, silence. Months later, I saw the photographs in a courtroom. I had come so close that night. If I had taken just a few more steps, I would have seen the blood everywhere. I will never forget the way that Karen made me feel, or the 2-night game she played with me before deciding to take it to someone else.